The day I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer, my husband didn't come to the hospital. He said he had a meeting he couldn't reschedule. A meeting. I was sitting in a beige examination room in St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, holding a pamphlet about oncology services that I hadn't actually read. And my husband was in a boardroom somewhere downtown talking about quarterly projections. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there looking at the pamphlet and thinking about how I'd made chicken soup that morning because he said he was feeling run down. I'd made him soup, and he couldn't come to the hospital. My name is Josephine. Most people call me Jo. I'm 34 years old. I was a dental hygienist at a practice in Scarborough, which is how I know how to talk to people who are scared and trying to pretend they're not. I'm good at that, reading the gap between what people say and what they mean. I thought that skill would protect me. It didn't. My husband. I'll call him my husband, not by his name, because honestly he doesn't deserve the dignity of a name in this story. We'd been married for 6 years. We met at a mutual friend's cottage in Muskoka, which feels almost embarrassingly Canadian to say, but that's where it happened. He was charming. He was the kind of charming that felt specific to you, like he'd studied you and decided exactly what you needed to hear. I know now that's not a compliment. When I called him from the hospital parking lot, standing in the October cold, my breath making little clouds in the air, he said, "Okay. So what does that mean for us going forward?" Not "Are you okay?" Not "I'm coming right now." What does that mean for us going forward? I should have understood everything in that moment. I really should have. But grief does something strange to your perception. It makes you want to fill in gaps with the most charitable interpretation. I told myself he was in shock. I told myself he didn't know how to respond. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true. The diagnosis was invasive ductal carcinoma. The oncologist, a brisk and kind woman who I immediately trusted, explained that we'd caught it at a stage where treatment was genuinely promising. Lumpectomy, radiation, possibly a short course of hormone therapy after. Not the worst news a person can receive in that room. I knew that. I was grateful for that. But knowing something could be worse doesn't make the thing that's happening feel smaller. I told my mother-in-law the next day. She lives out in Mississauga, in the house my husband grew up in, and I'd always had what I thought was a good relationship with her. She'd never been warm exactly. She had a quality of reserve that I'd mistaken for dignity. But she'd been kind enough at Christmas, at birthdays, at the wedding. I thought we understood each other. She listened to everything I said. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Well, I suppose these things happen." I waited for more. There wasn't more. "Will you be taking a leave from work?" she asked. I told her yes, probably, depending on how the treatment schedule worked out. "That'll affect the finances," she said. "Not. I'll help. Come stay with us, we'll get through this together. That'll affect the finances." I drove home from Mississauga in a kind of numb autopilot, and I sat in our kitchen for a long time without turning the lights on. My husband came home at 7:30. He microwaved something and ate standing over the sink. He didn't ask how I was. Here's the thing about discovering you have cancer at 34. It forces a kind of brutal clarity on everything around you. You stop having the energy to maintain comfortable illusions. Things you'd been carefully not noticing for years start to become impossible to ignore. I started noticing things. I noticed that my husband took phone calls in the backyard even in November. I noticed that he'd changed the password on his laptop. I noticed that there were dinners he said were work functions that I couldn't find any evidence of afterward. I noticed that he flinched slightly. Just slightly, whenever I mentioned my mother. My mother had passed away 3 years before the diagnosis. She'd left me her house, a semi-detached in East York that she'd owned outright, paid off over 30 years of work as a hospital administrator. She'd also left me her savings, which were modest but real, a little over $180,000 in a TFSA and an RRSP combined. The house was worth considerably more than that, of course, but I'd never thought of it as money. It was just the house, her house. The kitchen where she taught me to make jerk chicken, even though she always burned it slightly, and laughed about it. I'd never transferred the house into joint ownership with my husband. I'd been meaning to, in a vague someday way, but between work and life and then the diagnosis, it had never happened. My name was on the deed, my name alone. I think that's what saved me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Chemotherapy wasn't part of my initial treatment plan, but there was a period in November and December where it seemed like it might be, while my oncologist waited on some additional test results. Those weeks were the hardest. I'd go to my appointments alone because my husband said his work schedule was brutal that quarter. I'd sit in waiting rooms and watch other patients with their people, spouses, sisters, adult children, friends, and feel a particular kind of loneliness that I can only describe as structural. Like the foundation of what I'd thought my life was, had quietly cracked and nobody had told me. I called my sister-in-law once, during those weeks. I don't know why. Maybe I was still hoping for something from that side of the family. She said she was sorry to hear it, and then she mentioned very casually that she'd heard I might be selling my mother's house. I hadn't told anyone I was selling my mother's house, because I wasn't. Where did you hear that? I asked. Oh, I don't know, I must have gotten it mixed up, she said. After I hung up, I sat very still for a while. Then I went and found the folder where I kept all my important documents, and I spent 3 hours going through everything I could find related to the house and the estate. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I just knew something was wrong. I found a letter addressed to my husband from a real estate lawyer, dated 2 months earlier. It had been tucked inside a Canada Post envelope that I'd assumed was junk mail and shoved in the filing cabinet without opening. The letter referenced the East York property and an appraisal completed September 14th. September 14th, 7 weeks before my diagnosis. My husband had ordered an appraisal on my mother's house before he even knew I was sick. I didn't confront him that night. I knew with absolute certainty that if I confronted him without knowing everything, I would lose. He would explain it away. He would make me feel like I'd misunderstood, like I was paranoid, like the diagnosis had made me erratic. He was good at that. He'd been doing a smaller version of it for years. Instead, I called my Aunt Beverly. She is my mother's older sister, and we had not been close. Not because anything happened between us, but because geography and the ordinary drift of life had put distance between us. She lives in Hamilton, which is only an hour away, but in family terms it had felt further. She'd come to my mother's funeral, of course, and we'd hugged for a long time in the church parking lot. She'd said if I ever needed anything, and I'd said of course the way you do, and neither of us had done anything about it. When I called her, it was almost 10 o'clock at night. I told her I was sorry to call so late. She said she was watching the news and didn't care. I told her I'd been diagnosed. I told her what I'd found. I told her I was scared. She didn't say these things happen. She didn't ask about the finances. She said, "What do you need me to do?" 3 words, and I cried for the first time since the diagnosis. Not little tears, properly crying, the kind you feel in your chest. She stayed on the phone for an hour and a half. She told me she was coming to Toronto that weekend. She told me she was going to help me figure this out. She told me my mother would want me to fight. She came on Saturday morning with a casserole and a notepad, which sounds almost funny, but was exactly right. We sat at my kitchen table, while my husband was ostensibly at a hockey game, and we went through everything. Every document. Every financial record I had access to. She'd done bookkeeping for small businesses for 20 years. And she knew how to read paper trails. What we found took several hours to piece together, and even once I understood it, some part of me kept insisting it couldn't be real. My husband had been consulting with a financial advisor, specifically about the disposition of inherited assets during marriage in Ontario. He'd made inquiries about whether a spouse had any claim on property received as an inheritance. He'd apparently learned, as the law actually works in Ontario, that generally speaking an inheritance kept separate from marital property remains separate, which meant that my mother's house, in my name alone, was protected. That wasn't good enough for him. What he'd been doing, or attempting to do, was build a paper case that the house had effectively become a matrimonial asset, that I'd benefited from it during the marriage in ways that blurred the line. He'd consulted at least 2 lawyers. He was also, as nearly as Aunt Beverly could determine from the records I had access to, experiencing serious financial problems he hadn't told me about. A business investment that had gone wrong. Debt he'd accumulated before we married and never disclosed. The kind of numbers that make an East York semi-detached look like a solution. He'd known for at least a year. He'd known, and he'd married me anyway, and he'd been quietly building a case. I thought about September 14th, the appraisal, 7 weeks before my cancer diagnosis. Had he already been planning to push this forward? Had he been waiting for something? Some moment of vulnerability, some circumstance that would make me easier to manage? I thought about the meeting he couldn't reschedule. There's a moment in every hard story where you have to make a choice about what kind of person you're going to be on the other side of it. I'd been raised by a woman who worked 30 years and paid off a house by herself and made jerk chicken and laughed when she burned it. I decided I knew what to do. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I called a family law lawyer in downtown Toronto who specializes in contested marital property, and I got an emergency consultation that week. I brought Aunt Beverly with me. I brought every document we'd found. The lawyer, a composed woman in her 40s who made me feel immediately like I was in capable hands, confirmed what we'd suspected. The house was mine. The inheritance was protected. My husband's attempts to build a marital asset argument had significant legal obstacles. The debt was his. The deceit was documented. She also said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "The fact that he did this while you were ill is relevant. Courts take that into account." I want to be honest about what the next few months were like, because I don't want this to sound cleaner than it was. I was in radiation treatment through January and February. I was exhausted in a way I hadn't known was possible. Not just physically, but in some deeper register, like the weariness went all the way down. I was also doing the hardest thing I'd ever had to do, which was dismantle a marriage and a life at the same time I was fighting for my body. But I was not doing it alone. Aunt Beverly came every Thursday. She brought food and she sat with me through things, and she did not offer unsolicited opinions, which is a form of love people underestimate. She drove me to appointments when I was too tired to drive. She talked to me about my mother in ways no one else could, stories I'd never heard, things from before I was born, the texture of who my mother had been as a young woman. My husband moved out in January. He didn't do it gracefully. There were conversations I don't need to relive here, accusations that were themselves a form of confession. He said things that revealed exactly how he'd been thinking about me and the house and the money. Said them in anger without realizing they were evidence. My lawyer later told me that was not uncommon. The divorce was finalized in the fall of the following year. I kept the house. I kept my mother's savings untouched. My husband received what he was entitled to from our shared marital assets, which were modest, because we'd never pooled finances as fully as I thought we had. Another thing I came to understand in retrospect. His mother called me once, after the proceedings were complete. She said she hoped I didn't think badly of the family. I thought about all the right things to say. I thought about grace and restraint and the high road. Then I thought about that hospital parking lot in October. My breath making clouds. What does that mean for us going forward? I told her I needed to go, and I hung up. Here is what I know now that I didn't know 2 years ago. I know that cancer strips things down to what's essential. And sometimes what's essential turns out to be different from what you thought. I know that the people who show up in the terrible moments are the real architecture of your life, and everyone else is decoration you mistook for load-bearing walls. I know that an inheritance isn't just money and property. It's the embodiment of someone's work and love and intention, and protecting it is a way of honoring them. I know that Aunt Beverly, who came to Hamilton with a casserole and a notepad on a Saturday morning, is more family to me than 6 years of marriage ever produced. My treatment ended in March. The follow-up scans have been clear. I go back every 6 months, and I sit in the waiting room, and sometimes I still feel the ghost of that terrible loneliness. But it's a ghost now, not the thing itself. I went back to work part-time in April. I'm at the practice 3 days a week, and I'm learning how to be tired in a normal way again, which sounds small but feels enormous. I planted tomatoes in my mother's backyard this summer, in the same spot she always planted them, slightly too close together the way she always did. They grew anyway. Last week Aunt Beverly came for dinner, and we sat on the back porch until it got dark, and she told me another story about my mother I'd never heard, and we laughed until we were both wiping our eyes. I don't know what my mother would think about all of it. The marriage, the cancer, the fight. I think she would be angry for a while, and then she would be practical, and then she would make something to eat. I think she would tell me I did the right thing. I think she knew, when she put my name on that deed, exactly what she was doing.